Okay, so this class is going to look at genetic engineering and sustainable agriculture. We've mentioned genetic engineering already, but it's related to sustainable agriculture because by growing genetically modified crops, we can carry out more sustainable practices, although it's not really sustainable in itself, but it allows for sustainable practices to be covered. So conventional corn basically says no benefits, but it doesn't have the negatives associated with GM corn. So what are the sustainable factors related to genetically modified corn? First of all, it requires less pesticide. And the less pesticide you use, basically, the more sustainable it is. Because using pesticides is not a sustainable practice and produces enough calories to feed 88 million people or more per year. And that's from the corn alone. To have more productivity, in other words, you get more output from less input. And that makes it more sustainable because you're using up less resources. Um, these two are kind of related. Increase in farm yield. It increases the farmer's income. And of course, one of the factors for sustainability is income. So that is one factor involved. So the factor we're looking at here for sustainability is genetic engineering. And we need to point out that this topic has been covered uh, before. It was Objective 1, Part E, but this related to farming systems. Although, more or less, what we cover here is more or less what we did for Objective 1, Part E. Uh, we know that all living organisms are made up of cells, which are strings of DNA molecules, possessing instructions to make genes, from which have a unique blueprint determining how an organism grows, develops, and lives. Uh, Probably some people have a problem of calling it a blueprint. You know, the DNA really gives it's more like a recipe, giving instructions of how things are to be made, rather than a blueprint, a model which is already there. It just gives instructions. And genes make up about 1% of the DNA sequence. The rest is responsible for regulating when and how quantities of proteins are made. So one of the most important things about genes, basically, is switching on and switching off. Genetically engineering is a direct manipulation of genetic materials, and can call this the genome. So the genome of an organism is just the genetic material there, and by artificial means alter the hereditary traits of a cell or organism. This process can involve transfer of specific traits or genes from one organism to another, including across diverse species. We mentioned this before. You can get a gene from, say, a glowworm and put it into a goldfish, and that's what you call transgenetic transfer. So other types of genetic engineering involve removing or switching off genes, adding new genes, or introducing desired mutations. An organism that is created by modified genetic engineering is called a genetically modified organism. it can modify organisms by introducing mutations. Um, this you have not much control over this, and you don't necessarily know what the mutation will effect the mutation will have. So it's a more hit and miss. So it requires a lot of work to occasionally get a beneficial mutation. And genetic engineering in agriculture is different from traditional crossbreeding methods, which have been used for millennia. Traditional breeding methods more closely resemble accelerated evolution. You know, the natural evolution is called natural selection, and the traditional breeding methods is called artificial selection. So they're similar to each other. And breeders select organisms with a desired trait, and then further select and breed whichever of its offspring is fits that trait. It's a bit like natural selection that organisms with the trait most likely to survive are more likely to leave offspring. With artificial selection, it's even more so. So, a breeder seeking a disease-resistant tomato, for example, will grow many tomatoes, but save the seeds of only the most disease-resistant plants. After several generations, offspring will be much more disease-resistant than the progenitor, that's the original organism. Traditional breeding is done between the same or closely related species and keeps strands of DNA and gene sequences intact, uh, which can also mean the negative traits are reproduced alongside positive traits. Through genetic engineering, on the other hand, it is possible to isolate a single gene out of the whole genome and insert it into another. And with this is even more efficiently handled using CRISPR-Cas9 technology. And you can watch a video dealing with CRISPR-Cas9 technology in this place here. So, genetically engineered crops have been adopted at an exceptionally rapid rate. In 1997, 17% of US soybeans were planted with genetic engineered varieties. By 2014, the figure rose to 94%. So from 17 in 1997 to 94% in 2014. That's what, 17 years later. GE cotton usage went from 10% in 1997 to 91% in 2014. And GE corn acreage increased from 25% in 2000 to 92% in 2017. So this gives an example of how rapidly GE crops have been growing. The vast majority of these crops have been engineered to tolerate herbicides, and this is related, of course, to sustainable agriculture. So allowing plants to be sprayed with a particular chemical while the surrounding weeds die. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, is the most common. I suppose the issue here, of course, is that if we use a herbicide such as glyphosate, this can get into the surroundings, and this in fact is not a sustainable method. Other crops are engineered to produce their own natural pesticide, primarily to produce Bacillus thuringiensis, uh, or Bt naturally occurring bacterium that is lethal to a number of pests. We call it Bt corn. It increases drought resistance to improve nutritional content. So that Bt corn is a sustainable one. The Aqua Advantage salmon, the first animal approved for human consumption, was engineered for faster growth to reach its market weight much more quickly than natural salmon. So I suppose that is sustainable because the farmer can produce more profit. Um, in addition to corn, soybeans and cotton and other GE crops are commercially available. In the US are potatoes, papaya, squash, canola, alfalfa, apples, and sugar beets. Several others are USDA approved but not currently produced, including tomatoes, beets, rice, roses, flax, plums, tobacco. The controversial hormone RBGH, a recombinant bovine growth hormone, which increases milk production in dairy cows, is genetically engineered as well. The flavor saver tomatoes, engineered to retain tomato taste after shipping, was first GE food approved for human consumption, but has been taken off the market. More recently, the Impossible Burger, a meatless burger that uses genetically engineered yeast to make its signature ingredient known as heme, which gives a meat-like flavor, has been popping up on menus and causing controversy because it doesn't have FDA approval. In the US, regulatory approvals of GMOs are a complicated patchwork of Food and Drug Administration's for pharmaceutical development in the Environmental Protection Agency for insecticide uses and the USDA food crops. And for many farmers, GE crops require much less work and provide a larger yield, which offsets substantially the higher cost of GE seed. So larger yield, um, presumably using up less resources um, and more economically viable. One 2014 meta-study found that globally GE crops have reduced pesticide by 37%, increased crop yields by 22%, and increased farmer profits by 68%. And it's important to know that it was insect-resistant BT crops that have much more advantage than herbicide-tolerant crops. A 2014 analysis of USDA data had similar findings for insect-resistant crops in the US, but more mixed results on herbicide resistance. Certainly when farmers start with GE seeds, yields and profits increase in the first 2 years, but some studies show that this tapers off. For reasons discussed below, GMO technology is problematic for farmers and consumers alike. A meta-analysis is a statistical analysis that combines results of multiple scientific studies. Meta-analyses can be performed when there are multiple scientific studies addressing the same question, with each individual study reporting measurements that are expected to have some degree of error. Then, on a larger scale, corporate interest plays an enormous role in rapid growth of technology. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that scientists could patent a GE bacterium developed to break down oil spills. The ruling stated that life itself could be patented and owned, giving companies an incentive to develop GMOs that could be useful and profitable. And Monsanto, and we probably know of Monsanto, it has all kinds of unfortunate connotations associated with it, which is now part of Bayer. The largest manufacturer of GMOs has a long history as a chemical maker, including as one of the several makers of Agent Orange. Remember that, the highly toxic defoliant used during the Vietnam War. Following the war, companies turned to making agricultural chemicals, including the bestseller glyphosate herbicide. And of course, that is highly carcinogenic. Roundup and experimenting with genetically modified seeds to resist chemicals so that pesticides could be liberally applied without fear of killing the crops. It introduced Roundup Ready seeds in 1996 and spun off its chemical operations 2 years later to focus on biotechnology. In 2017, Monsanto's net sales of GE corn, soybean, and cottonseed and traits totaled 9.5 billion. Most troubling in the last 2 decades is that Monsanto has brought many competitor seed companies, giving it a control of a wide swath of seed market and accompanying genetic diversity. In 2018, Monsanto was bought by Bayer, further consolidating the production and ownership of seed stocks around the world. The biotech industry claims that chemical-based agricultural technology and biotechnology is necessary for a growing population, increasing crop yields, and adapt to changing climate. Herbicide-resistant crops do not require tilling. And remember, zero tillage is a sustainable practice, which leaves carbon in the ground and is better for soil structure. And proponents claim they will require less pesticide application than non-GE crops. So again, that's all about sustainability. However, this does not tell the whole story. These crops have actually driven up the use of herbicides like glyphosate, thereby increasing weed resistance and leading to the reintroduction of more potent herbicides. So you get this vicious cycle. These false narratives are perpetuated by biotech and other agribusiness corporations, but also by land-grant universities, which receive more funding from agrochemical companies than public dollars. Many agricultural scientists and farm organizations. So what we're having here is we're having farm organizations which depend on uh, money from uh, chemical companies, and therefore they downplay the harm that they do. But technology and industrialized food systems are not currently feeding the world, so there is skepticism about the claims. Globally, agriculture produces more than one and a half times the number of calories needed to feed the world population. Yet 1 in 9 people go hungry. The profit motive of Bayer, Monsanto, and other agrochemical companies, as well as the lack of support for small farmers, should subject their claims of working solely for public good to scrutiny. Well, there's many ways when you can really be worried about Monsanto. Uh, their goals tend to be profit motivated rather than for the welfare of people. Much of the debate around genetically modified crops and animals focuses on the potential threat to human health, but long-term studies of the impact of consuming GM foods has not yet to be done. Some independent studies have documented health effects on animals from eating GMO foods, which have become subject to controversy. Companies have determined that GE crops are different enough from those derived by conventional crops to get a patent, but not different enough to require adequate safety testing before they get to the market. Additionally, independent studies are testing unneeded. Ways in which GE foods can cause health problems are already documented, particularly in terms of allergens. Genes from an allergenic plant can transfer the allergen to the new plant, causing it to provoke a reaction in those sensitive to the first plant. It is also possible that the new allergens got created from combinations of genes that did not previously exist. And overall, though, we do not understand all the potential health concerns, but the uncertainty is enough to warrant more oversight, not less. Perhaps the most concerning consequence of herbicide-resistant crops is the huge increase in herbicide use and the evolution of herbicide-resistant superweeds. Weeds resistant to glyphosate, which have survived annual use of the herbicide, have become a problem. A 2016 survey across the Midwest found that one-third to upwards of three-quarters of the fields showed resistant weeds. To address the problem, seed chemical companies have turned to older chemicals such as 2,4-D and dicamba, engineering seeds resistant to these more toxic compounds and increase farmers' fields. Increasing the use in farmers' fields, Contrary to industry promises that GE crops would require less pesticide application, chemical use has increased steadily, particularly by farmers growing herbicide-resistant crops. So they grow those crops and then spray the field heavily with herbicides. Farmers growing Bt pest-resistant crops have been able to decrease their use of insecticide use, but scientists are concerned that the effect may not last, as pests evolve their own resistance. So there'll be some pests that eventually can use Bt corn, for example. One of the major ways GMOs have impacted the environment, therefore, has been the mass side effect of stemming from increase of pesticide use, including compromised water quality, loss of biodiversity, threats to human health. While biotech seeds are touted as the only way to feed growing world population, the data on yields are mixed. It would also be noted that GE crops rely on the promise of reduced pest and weed pressure to boost yields. No successful GE technique has yet been increased intrinsic yields, such as more kernels per corn cob. A 2008 literature review by the University of Concerned Scientists found that herbicide-tolerant GE crops produce no yield gain, while BT crops produce marginal increases. A 2013 New Zealand study found the average US GE corn yields were slightly lower than non-GE corn yields in Western Europe in the same period. And in 2016, studies by both National Academies of Science and the New York Times found no evidence that yield increase could be tied to GM technology. Meanwhile, traditional plant breeding techniques have increased yield significantly and have outperformed GE technology in improving drought tolerance and other factors necessary for farming in a warming climate. Remember that another aspect of sustainable agriculture is adaptability. And it seems that traditional plant breeding methods might have more adaptable crops than using GE technology. But investment in GE research means less funding for those going to these more promising methods. And farmers adopt GE seeds and attend their herbicides ostensibly to make farming easier and more profitable. However, GE seeds cost a lot more than conventional seeds. Plus, the cost of herbicides. An analysis by AgriWise farm businesses consultant Aaron Bloom found that GM corn costs an average of $81 more per acre than the conventional. For many farmers, the yield increase at harvest time makes the upfront cost worth it. But for others, the proliferation of superweeds or simply one bad harvest can put them in debt. So again, economic viability is challenged because of the higher initial cost. and the fact that a harvest might be less than expected can make that even more serious. So Congress passed the Plant Patenting Act in 1930 as the rise of hybrid corns made the business of selling seeds profitable for the first time. The law applied to certain plants only, but in 1985 it was expanded to include not only crops but also cells, genes, and DNA. Seed patents, along with laws on intellectual property, seed marketing, and more, have exploded in recent years. Humans have been breeding seeds for eons, making plants more productive, tastier, and better adapted to local conditions. In fact, adaptation has been bred into seeds through the ages by subsistence farmers. We take ancient farming breeding tenure for granted. Today's patents, meanwhile, bestow rights and profits on multinational companies for discovering the newest traits, ignoring the long and unsung contributions of farmers, localized agricultural knowledge. Uh, and we can more or less leave it at that point. So